Ever wondered what hidden gems once ruled the backyard grill long before ribs and hot dogs took over? In this video, we're traveling back through time to spotlight 7 classic barbecue dishes your grandpa likely treasured. Whether they stemmed from homemade ingenuity or Depression-era necessity, each forgotten specialty carries a story as rich as its flavor. Get ready to uncover the sizzling secrets of yesteryear and see why these recipes deserve a spot back on your modern summer table. Number 1. Hickory smoked rabbit. Many mid-20th century families, especially those living in rural or semi-rural areas, would occasionally rely on rabbit meat for weekend barbecues. Rabbits were relatively easy to raise or hunt, which made them a practical choice for feeding larger families during the 1930s and 1940s, when the Great Depression and World War II rationing shaped people's culinary habits. Grandfathers who were adept hunters brought home fresh rabbits, skinned them, and prepared them just like chicken, but gave them an extended marinade in a blend of salt, brown sugar, garlic, and maybe a splash of vinegar. By the 1950s, baby boomers old enough to help in the backyard learned to set up makeshift smokers using metal drums or repurposed barrels, packing them with hickory wood chips for a distinctly bold flavor. People in certain Appalachian regions even added a spritz of moonshine to the marinade, believing it tenderized the meat and made for better smoky undertones. Older community cookbooks occasionally publish step-by-step guides on how to butcher and brine rabbit to remove any gamey aftertaste. On days leading up to the barbecue, grandfathers would gather fresh hickory logs, then station themselves by the fire to ensure the temperature remained steady. Children remember the sweet, strong aroma drifting through the yard, mixing with the smell of freshly cut grass and newly opened soda bottles. Since rabbit meat can dry out quickly, these pitmasters had to bast frequently. They'd use long-handled brushes or even bunches of herbs tied together with twine, dipping them in a sauce mixture and slathering it over the meat at regular intervals. Recipes varied from household to household. Some folks preferred a mild sauce with more vinegar than sugar, while others might have used tomato paste or homegrown peppers for additional kick. Photographs from the 1940s sometimes show entire families seated around a simple wooden table, with big platters of smoked rabbit as the central dish, flanked by cornbread, boiled potatoes, and green beans. As mass-produced chicken and pork became cheaper and more widely available in the 1960s and 1970s, barbecued rabbit gradually retreated into the background. Younger folks increasingly found it unusual or even off-putting to see rabbit on the table, and supermarket convenience overshadowed older traditions of raising or hunting your own meat. Gen X children might vaguely recall their grandparents talking about rabbit barbecues or see black and white photos that prove it was once a cherished custom. Nevertheless, a few rural pockets still cling to it as a culinary keepsake, firing up hickory logs in summer and savoring the lean texture that stands apart from the more mainstream barbecue cuts. The memory of that distinctive smoke-laced flavor lingers for those who grew up with Grandpa's special marinade, reminding them of a time when home-raised livestock or wild game was far from a rarity, and every bit of fresh protein was worth celebrating at the pit. Number 2. Old-fashioned pork shoulder with vinegar mop. Most people today default to store-bought sauces for pork, but older generations developed unique homemade mop sauces that used vinegar and a modest amount of seasoning. Many families living in the Carolinas, Virginia, and other parts of the South specialized in this tangy tradition, which kept big cuts of pork shoulder moist and flavorful. During the 1930s and 1940s, when times were tough, people embraced inexpensive cuts that could feed extended families, especially during harvest gatherings or church picnics. Grandfathers would start with a sizable pork shoulder or Boston butt, seasoning it overnight in salt and pepper. They'd sometimes rub on a hint of brown sugar or even leftover coffee grounds to deepen the crust color. By sunrise, they'd have an outdoor pit dug or a barrel smoker set up, stoking the fire with hardwood. Baby boomers in the 1950s can still recall hearing local radio stations announce upcoming barbecue fundraisers, where entire neighborhoods pitched in money to buy big pork shoulders. Older men often took shifts tending to the fire, pausing just long enough to share stories about the war or about their youth in the 1930s. The defining characteristic of these shoulders lay in the vinegar mop sauce. It typically involved apple cider vinegar, crushed red pepper flakes, a little salt, sometimes black pepper, and maybe a dash of cayenne. The entire mixture went into a tin can or steel pot. Every half hour or so, someone would mop it onto the pork with a sturdy brush. Newspaper advertisements from the 1940s and 1950s sometimes displayed sketches of mop men, as they were humorously called, diligently coating the pork so it wouldn't dry out. By the end of the long smoking process, 6 to 10 hours depending on the shoulder size, the meat practically fell apart under a fork's gentle pressure, exuding a tangy aroma that blended sweet smoke with piquant vinegar. When the 1960s and 1970s arrived, bottled barbecue sauces loaded with refined sugar and tomato paste surged in popularity, shifting the nation's palate towards sweeter flavors. Many younger cooks found the sharp tang of vinegar mops too plain or too old-fashioned. As chain restaurants and newly franchised barbecue joints took hold, the homemade mop sauce tradition got overshadowed. However, in pockets of the South, older folks remain adamant that no store-bought brand can replicate that distinctive, bracing tang. Today, artisan barbecue chefs sometimes resurrect the old vinegar mop technique, billing it as authentic or heritage barbecue, which ironically mirrors what older generations simply called the everyday way of doing things. When grandchildren ask them about the secret behind that explosive flavor, many older pitmasters grin and point to a battered tin can half filled with spiced vinegar, recalling how the tried-and-true method once united entire communities for summertime feasts that lingered in memory long after the last coals cooled. Number 3, BBQ gizzards and hearts on skewers. Even though chicken is a common staple at modern barbecues, few people nowadays roast the gizzards and hearts on skewers in full view of party guests. Yet, from the 1930s through the 1950s, when people wasted very little, these organ meats frequently appeared alongside standard cuts at family cookouts. Grandfathers raised in frugal households remembered how their parents taught them to utilize the entire bird. They'd thread the gizzards and hearts onto metal skewers or even whittled wooden sticks, brush them with a mixture of oil, salt, pepper, and perhaps a pinch of paprika, then place them over direct heat for a quick char. During baby boomers' childhoods, seeing a line of sizzling skewers next to a mountain of chicken drumsticks seemed perfectly normal. Magazine articles from the 1940s sometimes offered tips on how to tenderize gizzards by simmering them briefly before grilling, ensuring they wouldn't turn rubbery on the fire. Families who grew vegetables in backyard gardens often combined the organ meats with chunks of bell peppers, onions, or tomatoes on the same skewer, allowing the juices to mingle. The aroma provided an enticing prelude to the main course. Children, equal parts curious and squeamish, watched the older folks chomp away on the tiny hearts, often dipping them in homemade hot sauce or mustard. By the 1960s, growing affluence and the availability of boneless, skinless cuts nudged organ meats aside, relegating them to a byproduct or a specialty item used primarily in gravies or pet food. Younger generations regarded organ meats as undesirable, focusing on convenient packages of wings, thighs, or breasts. Gen X kids in the 1970s and 1980s rarely saw their parents or grandparents grill gizzards and hearts, especially as quick-fix meals gained traction with busy work schedules. Still, older uncles or grandfathers might occasionally sneak a skewer of organ meats onto the grill at a family reunion, remembering the nutrient-dense morsels that once symbolized both thrift and skill. Old newspapers occasionally contained references to local fairs offering barbecued chicken hearts at concession stands, a nod to a time when folks found creative ways to showcase every part of the animal. Today, niche foodies and adventurous chefs sometimes rediscover this forgotten practice, hailing it as a form of nose-to-tail cooking that was second nature to Grandpa's generation. Number 4. Wood-planked fish with herbal baste. Many baby boomers recall grandparents who insisted on cooking at least one type of fish over the grill during summer get-togethers. A once common method in the 1940s and 1950s involved using wooden planks, frequently cedar or oak, to cradle the fillet or entire fish above the coals, imparting a subtle, earthy accent. Trout, catfish, or sometimes whitefish took center stage, depending on the region and local availability. Grandfathers who spent weekends fishing came home and cleaned their catch, then soaked wooden planks in water to prevent burning. They'd place the fish on the damp boards, generously brush it with a marinade of lemon juice, melted butter, a hint of onion, and a few sprigs of thyme or dill. The entire plank went over indirect heat, often near the edges of the grill, ensuring a slow roast that allowed the fish to absorb not only the marinade, but also the faint smokiness of the plank itself. Mid-century home economics classes sometimes taught young women the basics of plank grilling as a novel but practical method of meal preparation. Meanwhile, men enjoyed showing off their skill at controlling the grill temperature, making sure the fish turned flaky without drying out. Old black and white family snapshots from that era capture glimpses of fish-laden planks propped on cinder blocks or old metal racks. Newspapers occasionally ran short articles praising the cooking plank's role in delivering flavorful fish dinners that melt in your mouth. There was a certain sense of rural pride in demonstrating that you could catch, prep, and cook your own dinner entirely outdoors. During the 1960s and 1970s, as the industrialization of seafood advanced and freezers filled with fish sticks and battered fillets, the practice of wood-planked fish waned. People gravitated toward more conventional grilled options like hamburgers or hot dogs, leaving fish-based barbecues behind. Some families disliked the extra steps and cleanup associated with soaking and using the plank, not to mention disposing of the charred wood after. Gen X, growing up in a time of TV dinners and convenience foods, often had limited exposure to the tradition. Modern culinary movements focusing on sustainable seafood have, in some corners, revived plank grilling as an upscale or artisan technique, often appearing in trendy restaurants. Yet, for older folks who experienced it firsthand, it conjures images of simpler days when summertime meant fresh catches sizzling on a damp board, with Grandpa perched close by, a well-worn spatula in hand, ensuring his prized catch turned out perfectly moist and infused with the subtle perfume of smoldering wood. Number 5. Barbecued Hogma, pig stomach. While many are familiar with pulled pork, ribs, or pork chops, the idea of cooking pig stomach outside on a barbecue might raise eyebrows in modern contexts. However, from the 1930s through the 1950s, Hogma was embraced by a subset of families, especially those in Pennsylvania Dutch country or certain parts of the rural South, who prided themselves on using every part of the pig. Grandfathers who had lived through lean times, like the Depression, learned to transform less popular cuts into dishes that not only filled bellies but tasted memorable. Hogma typically required thorough cleaning, and older folks had a tried-and-true method of soaking and rinsing to remove impurities before stuffing it with a mixture of ground sausage, cubed potatoes, onions, and spices. Community potluck gatherings in the 1940s sometimes featured Hogma competitions where families compared recipes, each claiming to have found the perfect spice ratio. Though many Hogma recipes call for oven roasting, some families adapted them for the grill, placing the stuffed stomach over indirect heat, carefully rotating it to ensure even cooking. The outer surface would crisp while the stuffing inside cooked to a savory blend reminiscent of a sausage casserole. Newspapers occasionally publish local interest stories describing Hogma events, featuring proud grandfathers with prized cast iron pots and well-worn aprons. The smell alone was enticing, a unique pairing of pork, onions, and slow-roasted vegetables merging with the wood smoke. Baby boomers grew up helping peel potatoes or mix the stuffing, intrigued by the old-world charm of using an organ as a cooking vessel. By the 1960s, Hogma's presence declined, overshadowed by a focus on tidier, more easily packaged cuts and a growing squeamishness about offal. Many younger families found the cleaning process laborious, and with processed foods dominating supermarket shelves, Hogma fell out of fashion. Gen X might only have heard whispered references to that pig stomach thing Grandpa used to make at the family reunion. Yet older relatives talk fondly of the dish as a testament to thrift, tradition, and skill, an inheritance from times when the entire community valued nose-to-tail cooking. Today, Hogma might resurface at heritage festivals or niche barbecue contests, sparking curiosity among food adventurers. Nevertheless, for many who grew up in the 1950s, it remains a beloved memory of Grandpa's uncanny ability to turn unconventional cuts into a smoky, savory masterpiece that commanded respect at the potluck table. Number 6. Whiskey glazed pork jowl. Pork jowl, sometimes referred to as guanciale in Italian cuisine, had its own niche in old American barbecue culture, particularly in the 1930s through the 1950s among rural families. Grandfathers who worked in farming communities often butchered their own hogs and found the fatty jowl an ideal candidate for slow cooking over an open flame. The large quantity of marbled fat ensured a succulent bite, but it needed careful seasoning to avoid being overly greasy. Many families brine the jowl in a mixture of salt, pepper, brown sugar, and a dash of red pepper flakes for a day or two in a chilly cellar or icebox. Then, at barbecue time, they'd pat it dry, place it on the grill, and brush it repeatedly with a whiskey-based glaze. The alcohol would evaporate, leaving behind a sweet, savory crust that crackled around the edges. In the 1940s, local hardware stores sometimes gave out free barbecue pamphlets that contained recipes for lesser-known pig parts, encouraging residents to make full use of their animals. People recognized that jowl had a concentrated richness reminiscent of bacon, but was thicker and denser. The liquor-based glaze became a signature touch for many older men who might have had a small stock of homemade spirits or store-bought whiskey hidden away for special occasions. A slow-cooking jowl gave off an aroma that drifted across farmyards, summoning hungry children and curious neighbors alike. Baby boomers who ventured outdoors to watch the meat cook recall a sizzling cut that flared up whenever the glaze dripped onto the coals, prompting laughter and good-natured scolding from the pitmaster. By the 1960s, mass-produced bacon soared in popularity, overshadowing the humble jowl, which supermarkets seldom displayed prominently. Families shifted toward more recognizable cuts like pork loin, spare ribs, or country-style ribs for their barbecues. Younger generations perceived jowl as too old-fashioned or simply didn't know how to prepare it. The mid-1970s also saw an expansion of chain restaurants and commercial barbecue sauces that rarely acknowledged lesser-known items like pork jowl. Even so, some older home cooks continued the tradition, insisting that the high-fat, slow-cooked piece made for the best pork candy imaginable. Archival local newspapers occasionally featured short profiles of rural barbecue legends who refused to let jowl disappear from their repertoire. A small but enthusiastic subset of modern pitmasters have rediscovered pork jowl in an effort to honor the culinary legacy passed down by grandparents. When done correctly, the whiskey glaze melds with the succulent fat to form a layer of smoky sweetness that older generations believed rivaled any cut on the hog. Number 7. Bourbon Molasses Chicken Quarters. Before sweet commercial sauces took over grocery aisles, many older barbecue enthusiasts whipped up their own blends featuring a combination of bourbon and molasses, particularly for chicken quarters. During the 1930s and 1940s, molasses was a kitchen staple in numerous farming communities, often produced locally or purchased in large tins. Grandfathers who had a bit of bourbon stashed for a rainy day discovered that combining it with molasses, apple cider vinegar, onion powder, a pinch of chili pepper, and a dash of mustard seeds yielded an indulgent marinade. They'd let chicken quarters soak in this sticky concoction for a few hours, then place them on a grill fueled by hardwood coals. In the 1950s, baby boomers recall that Sunday afternoons were prime barbecue time, with extended family dropping by. The tantalizing aroma of bourbon molasses sauce caramelizing over an open flame drew folks out of the house, balancing the sweet notes of sugary syrup with the robust tang of the liquor. Community picnics frequently had a designated chicken station, where older men basted the quarters repeatedly, using small tin cups or jars and a paintbrush or improvised mop. People waited in line for a sample, tearing into the sticky, glazed skin and often remarking on the sauce's depth of flavor. Regional newspapers occasionally published short articles describing the correct ratio of molasses to bourbon, though every pitmaster, of course, insisted their ratio was the only true path to perfection. As the 1960s and 1970s progressed, new generation cooks started trying simpler methods, like sprinkling on a store-bought spice rub or using bottles of brand-name barbecue sauce. The stronger, more complex flavor of bourbon molasses marinade struck some palates as too intense, and families with small children shied away from the idea of incorporating alcohol in the sauce, even though most of it cooked off. Gen X, growing up in an age of fast food chicken restaurants, rarely encountered homemade marinades, requiring multiple steps and plenty of watchful tending. People also worried about over-charring or burning the sugary sauce, which can happen if you're not vigilant. By the 1980s, references to bourbon molasses chicken quarters were found mostly in old recipe boxes, tattered cookbooks, or in the recollections of grandparents who insisted the flavor was second to none. Occasionally, a new wave of culinary enthusiasts stumbles upon these old recipes and tries them out as a novelty, labeling them vintage barbecue. Yet for those who remember the shimmering glaze, sweet whiskey scent, and family members crowded around the grill, bourbon molasses chicken stands as one of the quintessential forgotten gems that used to headline Grandpa's summer feast.